Ashbrook, Oregon, November 23, 1991. The smell of burning cedar mixed with teenage laughter as sparks rose into the grey November sky above Mirror Lake. Sarah Linden adjusted her denim jacket against the Pacific Northwest chill, the fabric still holding the faint scent of her mother's lavender detergent from home. At 20, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd grown up in these woods, who knew every trail and swimming hole within 10 miles of Ashbrook. The bonfire crackled louder as Jake Morrison threw another branch onto the flames. Around the circle, familiar faces from her high school days glowed orange in the firelight, some now working at the lumber mill, others home from college like her. The conversation drifted between old memories and uncertain futures, the kind of talk that happens when childhood friends realize they're becoming strangers. "Remember when we used to camp out here every summer?" Amy Chen said, pulling her boyfriend's flannel tighter around her shoulders. "We thought we'd do it forever." Sarah smiled, but something restless stirred beneath her calm exterior. She'd changed during her sophomore year at Portland State, not just the way she dressed or talked, but something deeper. The small-town gossip that once felt comfortable now seemed suffocating. Earlier that evening, she'd overheard whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, meaningful glances exchanged behind her back. The fire began to die down around 10:30. Cars started their engines in the gravel parking area, headlights sweeping across the lake's dark surface. Sarah said her goodbyes, promising to call Amy before heading back to Portland after the weekend. She walked to her red Honda Civic, keys jingling in her pocket, the sound echoing off the water. "Sarah, wait up." She turned to see Evan Keller jogging toward her, his breath visible in the cold air. Evan had been part of their group since elementary school, the quiet one who fixed bikes and helped neighbors with yard work. He'd grown taller since graduation, but still had that same shy smile, the same way of looking at his feet when he talked to her. "Could I talk to you for a minute? It's important." Sarah glanced at her watch. Her parents expected her home by 11, and the drive along the winding lake road took 15 minutes. But Evan looked serious, almost troubled, in a way she'd never seen before. "Sure, but make it quick. Mum's making hot chocolate, and you know how she gets when I'm late." They walked a few steps away from the cars, toward the dock where moonlight painted silver streaks across the water. The last of their friends called out final goodnights before driving away, leaving them alone with the sound of gentle waves lapping against weathered wood. What Sarah didn't know was that this conversation would be her last. What Evan couldn't have predicted was how a few desperate words, spoken in fear and panic, would echo through Ashbrook for the next 34 years. By midnight, Sarah's Honda would be found on Mill Creek Road, driver's side door hanging open, headlights cutting through the darkness like eyes that had seen too much. Her purse sat untouched on the passenger seat, her college textbooks scattered on the back floor as if she'd left in a hurry or been forced to. The last person to see Sarah Linden alive was the one person no one thought to suspect. The first 48 hours felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for news that never came. Carol Linden hadn't slept since Sunday morning, when the Clackamas County Sheriff's deputy knocked on their door, hat in hand, asking if Sarah had made it home from the bonfire. The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "She always calls if she's going to be late," Carol told Detective Ray Hutchinson for the third time that Monday afternoon. "Even at college, even if it's just to say she's studying late at the library. She knows I worry." Tom Linden stood by the living room window, watching search teams organize in their front yard. Neighbors he'd known for 15 years moved through his property with flashlights and walking sticks, their voices carrying that particular tone people use around tragedy, hushed but purposeful, afraid of disturbing something already broken. The official search expanded beyond Mirror Lake by Tuesday. Volunteers from 3 counties joined the effort, combing hiking trails and abandoned logging roads that spider-webbed through the Cascade foothills. Local news crews set up outside the Ashbrook Community Center, turning their quiet town into a place marked by yellow crime scene tape and uniformed officers asking uncomfortable questions. Detective Hutchinson interviewed everyone who'd been at the bonfire. The stories were consistent. Sarah had seemed normal, maybe a little quiet, but nothing unusual for someone dealing with college stress. She'd left alone around 10:30, promising to call Amy Chen before the weekend ended. No one remembered seeing her talk to anyone suspicious or mention plans to meet someone later. Evan Keller was among those interviewed on Wednesday morning. He sat across from Hutchinson in the small conference room at the sheriff's station, his hands folded carefully in his lap, making eye contact when appropriate, but not too much. He'd known Sarah since they were kids, he explained. They weren't close anymore, different social circles. She was away at college, but they'd grown up together. He'd left the bonfire around the same time as everyone else, gone straight home to his cabin on Timber Ridge Road. Did you notice anything unusual about Sarah that night? Hutchinson asked, pen poised above his notepad. Evan shook his head slowly. She seemed like herself, maybe a little distracted, but college students are always stressed around holidays, right? What the detective couldn't see was the way Evan's left hand trembled slightly, or how he'd changed his shirt 3 times that morning, each one becoming soaked with perspiration despite the November cold. What he couldn't know was that Evan had spent the previous 2 nights scrubbing his cabin's stone fireplace with bleach, burning old clothes in his wood stove, and driving to a construction site 20 miles away to bury a blood-stained sweater beneath freshly poured concrete. By Thanksgiving Day, the search had covered 60 square miles. Divers explored the murky depths of Mirror Lake, while helicopters swept the forest canopy, looking for any flash of red fabric or disturbed earth. The local newspaper ran Sarah's college photo on the front page, her bright smile and confident eyes staring out from newsstands like an accusation. The theories began that first week and multiplied like rumors. Some believed she'd been taken by a stranger passing through town, maybe someone who'd seen a young woman alone on a dark road. Others whispered about a secret boyfriend or involvement with drugs. Portland was changing, they said, and college kids were different now. A few suggested she'd simply run away, started a new life somewhere else, though this theory never gained traction among those who really knew her. Carol Linden organized a candlelight vigil 2 weeks after Sarah disappeared. More than 200 people gathered at Mirror Lake, holding flames against the evening wind, while Sarah's pastor spoke about hope and faith. Tom read a letter Sarah had written to them during her first semester, full of plans for summer internships and graduate school applications. His voice broke twice, but he finished every word. Evan stood at the back of the crowd, his candle flickering in the darkness. When people looked at him, they saw a young man grieving for a childhood friend, someone carrying the same questions and fears as everyone else in Ashbrook. They couldn't see the weight he carried, the secret that made sleep impossible and turned every knock at his door into a potential catastrophe. As winter deepened and leads went cold, the searchers returned to their normal lives. The news crews moved on to other stories. Detective Hutchinson kept Sarah's file active, but new cases demanded attention, and without evidence or witnesses, there was little left to investigate. The Linden house became a shrine. Carol couldn't bring herself to change Sarah's room, textbooks still open on her desk, clothes still hanging in her closet, a half-finished letter to her roommate still sitting by her computer. Tom wanted to move, to escape the constant reminders, but Carol refused to leave. What if Sarah came home? What if someone finally called with answers? Years passed. The case grew cold, but never quite died, surfacing each November in newspaper anniversary articles and during slow news cycles. Carol aged visibly, her hair turning white, her smile becoming something she wore for other people's comfort. Tom threw himself into work at the credit union, staying late to avoid coming home to a house full of ghosts. Evan continued living quietly on Timber Ridge Road, fixing neighbors, fences, and volunteering at church functions. He dated occasionally, had a few long-term relationships, but something always went wrong. He couldn't explain the nightmares, the sudden need to leave town for weekends, the way certain songs or smells could send him into spirals of anxiety that lasted for days. The secret lived in his chest, like a second heart, pumping guilt through his veins with every beat. Ashbrook, Oregon, March 15, 2025. The ladder creaked under Marcus Rivera's weight as he pushed aside another section of pink insulation in the Linden house attic. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, streaming through the small window, and the air smelled of old wood and decades of Pacific Northwest dampness. He'd been working on the renovation for 3 weeks now, transforming the house he and his wife Elena had bought into something that could hold new memories instead of old sorrows. "Find anything interesting up there?" Elena called from the kitchen below, where she was scraping layers of wallpaper from the breakfast nook. "Just more insulation and some old Christmas decorations," Marcus replied, though something had caught his eye, a section of floorboard that didn't quite match the others, as if it had been cut and replaced at some point. He'd been a carpenter for 15 years and recognized the subtle signs of amateur repair work. The previous owners, an elderly couple from Seattle, had bought the house from the bank in 2003. They'd told Marcus and Elena about its history during the closing, how it had belonged to a family whose daughter disappeared in the early 1990s, how the parents had eventually moved away, unable to bear the constant reminders. The couple had lived there peacefully for over 20 years, but were now downsizing to a retirement community. Marcus knelt beside the mismatched board and ran his fingers along its edges. The wood was slightly warped, as if moisture had gotten underneath at some point. Using his pry bar, he carefully lifted the section, expecting to find evidence of an old leak or maybe a mouse nest. Instead, he found a wooden chest about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in several layers of plastic garbage bags that had protected it from moisture and time. "Elena," he called, his voice carrying a weight that made her stop scraping and listen. "You need to come up here. Now." 20 minutes later, they sat in the kitchen with the chest between them on the table, neither quite ready to open it. The plastic wrapping had yellowed with age, and through the clear sections, they could see dark wood stained with what might have been water damage or something else. Elena was the one who finally cut through the plastic with kitchen scissors, her hands steady despite the gravity of what they might find. The chest itself was simple pine, the kind of small trunk someone might use to store keepsakes or important papers. There was no lock, just a brass latch that opened with a soft click. The first thing they saw was a spiral notebook with a burgundy cover, the kind college students used in the early 1990s. Sarah Linden's name was written on the front in blue ballpoint pen, along with English 201, fall semester. Beneath the notebook, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a roll of 35mm film, the kind that required professional developing, its metal canister slightly tarnished but intact. At the bottom of the chest, folded carefully and stained with something dark that had long since dried to a rusty brown, was a cream-colored sweater with tiny pearl buttons. Eleanor's hand went to her mouth. They both recognized the sweater from the missing person flyers that still appeared occasionally in local newspapers. The same photo that had watched over Ashbrook like a guardian angel for more than 3 decades. Marcus called the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office immediately. Within an hour, Detective Lena Moore arrived with a crime scene photographer and evidence technician. Moore was 42, a transplant from California who'd joined the department 5 years earlier with a reputation for solving cold cases. She'd heard about the Sarah Linden disappearance, but had never worked it directly. It had been cold long before she arrived in Oregon. "Have you touched anything besides the chest itself?" she asked, pulling on latex gloves. "Just to open it," Elena replied. "So we used scissors on the plastic mouse, but we didn't touch the contents." Moore photographed everything in place before carefully removing each item. The journal's pages were filled with Sarah's handwriting, class notes, personal thoughts, fragments of poetry. Some entries were routine, discussing assignments and weekend plans. Others hinted at tension, references to people talking and secrets that shouldn't exist. One entry from November 15, 1991, 8 days before Sarah disappeared, was particularly revealing. "Saw E at the hardware store today. He looked right through me like I wasn't there. Can't believe I was stupid enough to trust him. Mom always said people show you who they really are if you pay attention. Wish I'd listened." Some things can't be taken back once they're said. The film would need to be developed using special techniques for aged negatives, but Moore could see images on the roll that appeared to show people around a campfire. The sweater would require extensive forensic testing, but the stains were consistent with blood that had dried over many years. Moore bagged everything according to protocol, but as she prepared to leave, she turned back to Marcus and Elena. "You should know that this discovery is going to change things for a lot of people in this town. Some secrets have been buried for 34 years. That's a long time to carry something like this." That evening, Moore spread the journal entries across her desk and began reading Sarah's thoughts from the last weeks of her life. Between homework assignments and social observations, a pattern emerged, references to betrayal, to misplaced trust, to someone identified only by the initial E, who had apparently violated Sarah's confidence in some significant way. The final entry was dated November 22, 1991, the day before Sarah disappeared. "Decided I can't keep quiet anymore. It's not just about me now. E thinks he can pretend it never happened. But some things don't just go away because you ignore them. Going to talk to him tomorrow night after the bonfire. Time for the truth, whatever that costs." Moore reached for her phone to call the cold case unit. After 34 years, Sarah Linden was about to tell her story. Detective Lena Moore had spent 3 sleepless nights studying the developed photographs. Most showed exactly what she'd expected: young people around a campfire, laughing and talking, frozen moments from Sarah Linden's last evening alive. But the final frame told a different story. In it, Sarah stood near the dying bonfire, pointing her camera at someone outside the frame. The expression on her face wasn't the casual happiness of the earlier photos. This was confrontational, almost accusatory, as if she were documenting something important. The timestamp on the back of the developed print read 10:47 p.m., just minutes before witnesses said she left Mirror Lake. Moore had run that photograph through facial recognition software, cross-referenced it with her list of everyone who'd been at the bonfire, and come up with one name that made her stomach tighten: Evan Keller. Now, 34 years after he'd sat in this same interview room as a person of interest, Keller faced her across a metal table that had heard countless confessions and denials. He was 54 now, his brown hair thinning at the temples, his hands showing the calluses and scars of someone who'd worked construction his entire adult life. He'd agreed to come in voluntarily when Moore called, even offered to drive himself to the station. "I appreciate you coming in, Mr. Keller," Moore began, placing Sarah's journal on the table between them. "I'm hoping you can help me understand some things about Sarah Linden." Keller's eyes flicked to the journal, and something shifted in his expression, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that Moore had learned to recognize during her 15 years in law enforcement. "I haven't thought about Sarah in years," he said, though his voice carried the slight tremor of someone working hard to appear calm. "Terrible thing. What happened to her? We all wondered where she went." Moore opened the journal to a marked page. "She wrote about you quite a bit in the weeks before she disappeared. Here, from November 15th. Saw E at the hardware store today. He looked right through me like I wasn't there." She looked up. "The E stands for Evan, doesn't it?" Keller's hands, resting on the table, began to fidget with his wedding ring, a nervous habit Moore noted in her mental file. "Sarah and I knew each other as kids, but we weren't close anymore. Different lives, you know. I probably didn't even notice her at the store. I was likely thinking about work or groceries or whatever. What about this entry from November 20th, E?" Moore flipped forward several pages. "Can't believe I was stupid enough to trust him. Some things can't be taken back once they're said." She paused. "What did you and Sarah talk about that she couldn't take back?" The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Keller stared at his hands, and when he finally looked up, Moore saw something crumbling behind his eyes, a wall that had held for over 3 decades, but was finally beginning to give way. "There was something," he said quietly. "Something from when we were teenagers. Sarah, she saw something she shouldn't have seen, made assumptions that weren't true." Moore leaned forward slightly. "What kind of assumptions?" Another long pause. "Then, there was an incident at the lumber mill in 1989. An accident. A worker got hurt, badly hurt, and there were questions about safety protocols, about whether the company had been cutting corners. Sarah was dating Jake Morrison then, and his father was the safety inspector who was supposed to file the report. The story came out in fragments, like pieces of glass being carefully extracted from an old wound. In 1989, 17-year-old Evan had been working summer jobs at the Morrison lumber mill. During a shift change, improper safety procedures had led to an accident that left a worker paralyzed. The company had been facing bankruptcy and couldn't afford another OSHA violation or lawsuit. "Mr. Morrison asked me to say the accident happened differently than it did," Keller continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Said if I testified that the worker had been drinking, which he hadn't, the company could claim it wasn't their fault. Said he'd make sure I got a full-time job after graduation, help me get established." Sarah had overheard a phone conversation between Evan and Morrison's father, had pieced together enough to understand that Evan had committed perjury in a case that had destroyed another man's life. She confronted me about it that fall, but I denied everything, made her think she'd misunderstood. She was just a kid, and I was scared of losing everything, my job, my future, maybe going to prison for perjury. Keller's hands shook now. I thought she'd forgotten about it by the time she went to college, but Sarah hadn't forgotten. Moore showed him the final journal entry, dated the day before Sarah disappeared, where she'd written about not being able to keep quiet anymore. "She came to your cabin after the bonfire that night, didn't she?" Moore asked. Keller's composure finally broke. Years of carrying the secret, of building a life on a foundation of lies, of watching Carol Linden age with grief while he knew exactly what had happened to her daughter, it all collapsed at once. "She was angry," he said, tears streaming down his face. "Angrier than I'd ever seen anyone. Said she'd been doing research for a journalism project at college. looking into workplace safety violations, and she'd found the case. Found out that the worker, his name was David Chen, Amy's uncle, had never recovered, still couldn't work, family had lost everything. The confrontation at Keller's cabin had escalated quickly. Sarah hadn't come to ask questions. She'd come to tell Evan that she was going to the authorities, that she couldn't live with knowing what he'd done to an innocent family. I begged her not to, Keller continued. Told her it would ruin my life, that it was too long ago to matter now. But she said it wasn't about me anymore, said David Chen deserved justice, even if it was 30 years late. In his panic, Evan had grabbed Sarah's arm, trying to prevent her from leaving. She'd pulled away, stumbling backward toward his stone fireplace. The fall hadn't been intentional, but the result was catastrophic. Sarah struck her head on the hearth with a sound Keller said had haunted his dreams for 34 years. I tried to help her, he sobbed. I called her name, checked for a pulse, but she was gone. Just like that, she was gone. In his terror, Keller had made the decision that would haunt Ashbrook for decades. He'd wrapped Sarah's body in a tarp and driven to an abandoned logging site near the old Morrison mill, a location with bitter irony that wasn't lost on Detective Moore. He'd buried her in a shallow grave, then returned to his cabin to clean up the evidence. But he couldn't bring himself to throw away everything that had belonged to her. The journal, the roll of film from that last night, the sweater she'd been wearing. He'd gathered it all into a wooden chest and hidden it in the one place no one would think to look, the attic of the Linden family home. I thought if her parents ever found it, they'd at least know she wasn't suffering somewhere, Keller said. I thought maybe it would give them some peace, knowing she hadn't been taken by some monster. But years went by and they never found it, and I couldn't make myself tell them. Moore called for additional units and a search team. Within hours, they were at the logging site Keller had described, using ground-penetrating radar to locate the gravesite. The remains were found exactly where he'd said they would be, along with fragments of the tarp and clothing that had helped preserve them through 34 Oregon winters. But there was one final twist that no one, including Evan Keller, had anticipated. During the forensic examination of the sweater found in the attic, technicians discovered something that had been overlooked in the initial evidence processing: DNA that didn't belong to either Sarah or Evan. The genetic material was degraded but sufficient for analysis, and when it was run through the national database, it matched a profile that made Detective Moore's blood run cold. David Chen, the worker whose accident had started the chain of events leading to Sarah's death, had died by suicide in 1995, 4 years after Sarah disappeared. But he'd left behind a son, Marcus Chen, who had spent years believing his father's accident was simply bad luck, that his family's financial ruin was nobody's fault. The DNA on the sweater belonged to Marcus Chen, not from 1991, but from much more recently, sometime within the past 5 years. When Moore confronted him, Marcus Chen broke down immediately. He'd discovered the truth about his father's accident 2 years earlier, while going through papers after his mother's death. He'd learned about the perjured testimony, the cover-up, the role Evan Keller had played in destroying his family. Marcus had been planning his revenge for months when he'd heard that the old Linden house was being sold. He'd broken in one night, intending to plant evidence that would finally expose Keller's role in the lumber mill incident. Instead, he'd found Sarah's chest hidden in the attic. I was going to destroy it, he admitted to Moore. I thought if I got rid of the evidence, Keller would never be caught, and I could deal with him my own way. But when I saw what was in that chest, when I realized what had really happened to Sarah Linden, I couldn't do it. She deserved justice, even if my father never got any. Marcus had resealed the chest and returned it to the attic, but not before handling the sweater with his bare hands, leaving behind the DNA evidence that would ultimately expose both crimes. The revelation sent shockwaves through Ashbrook. Evan Keller was charged with manslaughter and tampering with evidence. The Morrison lumber mill case was reopened, leading to federal charges for perjury and obstruction of justice. Marcus Chen pled guilty to breaking and entering, but received probation in recognition of his cooperation and the extraordinary circumstances of the case. On a grey April morning, Carol and Tom Linden stood beside Sarah's grave in Ashbrook Cemetery, finally able to lay their daughter to rest. The headstone bore the dates of her birth and death, but also a line from one of her college poems found in the journal, "Truth has its own timeline." Detective Moore's final report noted that while the case was officially closed, questions remained about the broader conspiracy that had shaped Sarah's fate. The mill incident had involved multiple people who chose silence over justice, creating the conditions that led to a young woman's death 34 years later. In her concluding remarks, Moore wrote, "This case reminds us that secrets don't disappear simply because we bury them. They wait, sometimes for decades, until someone is brave enough to dig them up. Sarah Linden was trying to be that person. In the end, she succeeded. Though she never lived to see the truth she died pursuing finally come to light. The Linden house now belongs to a new family, one that will fill its rooms with laughter and hope instead of grief and unanswered questions." But sometimes, on quiet evenings when the Pacific Northwest rain taps against the windows, neighbors say you can still feel the presence of a young woman who refused to let injustice remain hidden forever. Sarah's story became a testament to the power of truth to transcend time, and to the courage it takes to speak up when silence seems safer. Her voice, preserved in journal pages and developed photographs, had reached across 34 years to demand the justice she'd been seeking on that last night by Mirror Lake. The case that had haunted Ashbrook for generations was finally closed, but its lessons would echo through the community for years to come, that some secrets are too heavy to carry alone, that justice delayed is not always justice denied, and that sometimes the dead speak loudest of all.